Donald Trump's 28-point Ukraine peace proposal didn't simply arrive in Kyiv. It landed with the force of a political thunderclap. Handed formally to President Vladimir Zelensky, the plan jolted European capitals, unsettled Kyiv's leadership, and forced Washington into rapid clarification. Why such shock? Because Trump's outline doesn't pretend to maintain the status quo. It tackles head-on issues Russia has long argued lie at the core of the conflict: NATO expansion, Ukraine's military orientation, and the status of territories Moscow considers historically, culturally, and strategically tied to Russia. As Zelensky heads into meetings with top US officials, he now confronts a proposal that could redefine the battlefield and Europe's future security order. But if Europe rejects it, Kyiv fears it, and Moscow treats it cautiously, is this peace blueprint already politically impossible? Hello and welcome. You're watching Statecraft with me, Geeta Mohan. The plan's origins are just as consequential. Developed after quiet discussions between US envoy Steve Witkoff and his Russian counterpart Kirill Dmitriev, the proposal surfaces at a moment when Russia has announced new battlefield advances. Ukraine faces a $100 million corruption scandal, and European leaders feel sidelined. Meanwhile, Trump has shifted the cost of Ukraine aid onto NATO allies, tightened sanctions on Russian energy companies, and declared securing peace as his administration's top priority. In this climate of pressure and fatigue, the question becomes: can a plan rooted in addressing Russia's long-standing grievances form the basis of a durable settlement? Trump's 28-point document begins with an attempt to reset Europe's entire security architecture, a broad non-aggression pact between Russia, Ukraine, and European states, described as resolving all ambiguities of the last 30 years.
President Trump has made it very clear since day one, and even on the campaign trail, that he wants to see this war come to an end. He has grown increasingly frustrated with both sides of this war, Russia and Ukraine alike, for their refusal to commit to a peace agreement. But nevertheless, the president and his national security team are steadfast in seeing this war come to an end, to end the killing and deliver on the president's promise. Special Envoy Witkoff, Marco Rubio, have been working on a plan quietly for about the last month. They've been engaging with both sides, Russia and Ukraine, equally to understand what these countries would commit to in order to see a lasting and durable peace. So they have been engaged with both sides, and these talks are continuing. As always, I'm not going to litigate the details of this plan as it's ongoing and it's in flux, but the president supports this plan. It's a good plan for both Russia and Ukraine, and we believe that it should be acceptable to both sides, and we're working very hard to get it done.
For Russia, this is the first acknowledgement from Washington that European security cannot be built by ignoring Moscow's concerns. But for many in Europe, the proposal appears to codify what they see as Russia's strategic priorities, halting NATO expansion and formalizing a security buffer. The plan says Russia will not invade neighboring countries and NATO will cease enlargement, a formulation Moscow views as essential to ending what it calls decades of Western encroachment. With NATO deeply involved in Ukraine's defense, even a temporary freeze on new members challenges a principle Europe holds sacred. Ministers privately ask, is this a genuine blueprint for stabilization or a concession to Russian security logic? Trump's draft also proposes US-mediated dialogue between Russia and NATO aimed at de-escalation and long-term economic cooperation. But its generalities and the lack of legally enforceable obligations on Russia have alarmed European diplomats who have long insisted that broad, trust-based agreements with Moscow are insufficient. The plan offers Ukraine reliable security guarantees, including what would be the first explicit American commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty. Yet the guarantees include strict conditions. If Ukraine attacks inside Russia without cause, US protection ends. If Russia violates the agreement, a decisive coordinated military response follows. but only after sanctions are reinstated. Critics in Kyiv fear the deal limits Ukraine's strategic freedom more than Russia's. The plan then outlines a restructuring of Ukraine's military, capping its forces at 600,000, down from wartime levels approaching 850,000. Moscow argues such limits are necessary for any long-term peace, pointing to its own fears of a heavily militarized Ukraine on its border. European capitals, however, see the reduction as risky, relying heavily on assumptions about Russian restraint. The proposal then formalizes what Russia has demanded for decades: Ukraine permanently renounce NATO membership, and NATO codifies that Ukraine will never join. To Russia, this is the foundation of any settlement. To Europe, it violates the principle that sovereign countries choose their alliances. NATO would also be prevented from placing troops in Ukraine, aligning with Russia's insistence that foreign military infrastructure near its borders is an existential threat. Only European fighter jets in Poland are mentioned as a counterbalance. A distinctly American clause follows. The US would receive compensation for providing Ukraine security guarantees. For Russia, tying Ukraine's guarantees to strict conditions is seen as a stabilizing measure. For Kyiv and Europe, it raises concerns about imbalance. Economically, the plan offers Ukraine a path toward EU integration and outlines massive reconstruction efforts, including American partnerships to rebuild critical energy infrastructure. The World Bank could create a dedicated fund for Ukraine's recovery. Then comes a central Russian priority: gradual reintegration into global markets, sanctions relief, renewed US-Russia cooperation, and an invitation to rejoin the G8. A symbolic acknowledgement of Russia's place in the international order. European officials view this as rewarding Moscow too quickly, but for Russia, reintegration is not a reward. It is a prerequisite for stabilizing global energy markets, supply chains, and security cooperation. The chapter on frozen funds proposes channeling $100 billion from Russian assets into US-led reconstruction, with the US receiving half the profits. Europe contributes another $100 billion. Remaining funds would enter a US-Russia investment framework. Moscow is expected to resist any system that uses its assets without consent. Europeans worry about losing influence over post-war reconstruction. Territorial arrangements remain the most contentious section. Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk are recognized as de facto Russian, reflecting Moscow's long-standing claims and the 2014-2022 realities on the ground. Kherson and Zaporizhia are frozen along current lines, effectively acknowledging partial Russian control. Ukraine would withdraw from its remaining positions in Donetsk, creating a demilitarized buffer zone legally designated as Russian territory but closed to Russian troops. Europeans see territorial concessions. Russia views them as recognition of the facts it considers irreversible. A ceasefire would activate once both sides pull back. Oversight would rest with a peace council chaired by Donald Trump, empowered to impose sanctions on either side. Moscow will likely insist on equal representation within any enforcement body. Now, Zelensky responded cautiously, saying he appreciated the efforts while defining Ukraine's goal as a worthy peace. He acknowledged the US had shared its vision but avoided endorsing specific elements. His nightly address underscored that peace must prevent future invasion, a clear message to both Washington and to Moscow. European leaders were more direct. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas declared the plan unworkable without Europe's involvement and warned that responsibility must fall on the aggressor.
What we as Europeans have always supported is a long-lasting and just peace, and we welcome any efforts to achieve that. Of course, for any plan to work, it needs Ukrainians and Europeans on board. So this is very clear.
Germany's foreign minister said the plan was a list of topics, not an agreement.
Ich bewerte den nach wie vor so, dass es
I still consider it to be a list of issues that urgently need to be discussed between Ukraine and Russia, not a final plan. I welcome once again the fact that the United States of America is also attempting to bring both parties to the table. The German position is the European position, and that means we are backing Ukraine. We want to ensure that Ukraine can discuss these points from a position of strength, and it will be Ukraine that has to decide what compromises to make, just as Russia has to make such decisions on its part. We are not arbitrators here, but we are Ukraine's advocates, because Ukraine is defending its own freedom and the freedom of Europe.
Across European capitals, frustration is high. They were excluded from negotiations despite carrying most of Ukraine's financial burden. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha reportedly told European partners the proposal reflects Russia's diktats and warned that giving ground invites future conflict. A senior European official said the timing, amid scandals and frontline pressure, couldn't be worse for Kyiv. Kremlin's reaction was measured. Dmitry Peskov said there had been contacts with the US but no formal negotiations, reiterating that any settlement must address the root causes. Russia's long-stated objections to NATO expansion and the post-Cold War security order.
No, on this subject matter, I can only say what we have already repeated many times yesterday. We cannot add anything new to what was said in Anchorage. Any time is the best for a peaceful settlement, for a settlement by peaceful political and diplomatic means. Russia remains open for this settlement. A settlement must lead to the elimination of the root cause of this conflict. This is what we say, time and again.
Trump continues applying pressure on Russia through sanctions while simultaneously offering a framework Europeans view as accommodating Moscow's demands. The result is a diplomatic puzzle. No side fully rejects the plan, but none accept it as written. So as Zelensky prepares for more consultations, European leaders attempt to form a unified response, and Russia waits for specifics. Is Trump's plan a viable starting point for negotiations or a high-profile proposal doomed by mistrust on all sides? Thank you for watching Statecraft.